There's something you can't see. Not in front of you, not in the news, not in the places you think you're watching. It's here, inside your mind. Right now, as you're watching this, there's a silent war happening, a war not fought with weapons, but with ideas. Orders aren't shouted, they're planted. The thoughts you believe are yours. The choices you call freedom, even the desires you defend. What if they were never truly yours? Here's the uncomfortable truth. You're not being manipulated sometimes. You're being manipulated every single day in ways that are subtle, invisible, calculated. Ads that don't just sell you products, but reshape what you want. Content that doesn't just entertain you, but programs how you think. People who aren't convincing you, but quietly redirecting you without you even noticing. And the most dangerous part, you don't see it. Because the most powerful form of control is the one that makes you believe you're free. But here's where everything changes. Because there is one weapon that can break this entire system: awareness. When you start seeing the invisible strings, they begin to lose their power. When you understand how ideas are planted, you stop accepting them blindly. When you realize how you're being guided, you take back control, step by step. This isn't just a video, it's a revelation. A shift in how you see the world, your choices, your relationships, and yourself. After this, you won't see things the same way again. Because you're about to uncover the invisible strings. Let's begin. Part 1. Understanding the Game. Chapter 1. The Psychology of Control. What manipulation really is. Let's start with a definition that most people get wrong. When people hear the word manipulation, they imagine a villain, a scheming, cold-blooded individual who consciously and deliberately constructs elaborate deceptions to extract something from their victims. They imagine malice. They imagine awareness on the part of the manipulator. A knowing, predatory awareness of exactly what they're doing and why. This picture is not wrong exactly, but it is dangerously incomplete. And incomplete definitions are how entire categories of manipulation remain invisible. The truth is that most manipulation is not performed by villains. It is performed by systems, by institutions, by cultures, and by ordinary people who often have no conscious awareness that they are doing it at all. A parent who uses guilt to keep an adult child nearby is not necessarily calculating. An employer who frames every request as an opportunity to grow is not necessarily sinister. A friend who withdraws affection whenever you disagree with them has perhaps never once used the word manipulation to describe their own behavior. But the effect is identical. Your behavior is being shaped, not by the clear exchange of information and your rational response to it, but by emotional pressure, social incentive, cognitive shortcuts, and psychological architecture that bypasses your reasoning mind entirely. Manipulation is any attempt to influence another person's thoughts, feelings, or behaviors through means that circumvent their rational agency. It is influence that works not because it gives you information and lets you decide, but because it pulls levers you didn't know you had. Sometimes the lever puller knows what they're doing. Often they don't. The lever still gets pulled. This definition is important because it removes the moral drama from the question of detection. You don't need to decide whether someone is a bad person in order to recognize that you're being manipulated. You simply need to notice whether the influence you're experiencing is being applied to your reasoning or to your nervous system. The difference between influence and control. Not all influence is manipulation. This matters. Legitimate influence gives you more information and trusts you to use it. A doctor who explains your diagnosis and the evidence behind a recommended treatment is influencing you. A friend who points out that a decision you're about to make contradicts your stated values is influencing you. A writer who marshals evidence and argument to change your mind on an issue is influencing you. In each case, your rational faculties are engaged, your autonomy is respected, and you emerge from the encounter with more capacity to decide, not less. Control, by contrast, reduces your capacity to decide. It works not by informing your reasoning, but by circumventing it. It uses emotional states, fear, guilt, shame, desire, envy, as levers. It exploits the well-documented quirks and vulnerabilities in human cognition. It creates social pressure that makes rational refusal feel socially impossible. It operates on timelines so tight that reflection cannot occur. The difference is not always obvious in the moment. This is one of the central challenges of this book. Sophisticated manipulation often presents itself as legitimate influence, using the language of honesty, care, expertise, and reason, while functioning through entirely different mechanisms underneath. One useful test after the encounter: do you feel more yourself or less? Do you feel that you made a choice, or that a choice was made for you? Do you feel informed or steered? These feelings are not infallible guides, but they are signals worth attending to. The body often knows before the mind catches up. Another test: could the person influencing you have achieved the same outcome by giving you complete information and time to think? If not, if the speed, the emotional pressure, the social context were essential to the outcome, then something other than legitimate influence was at work. These tests will serve you throughout this book. Keep them close. Why humans are easy to manipulate. The human brain did not evolve to navigate the modern world. It evolved to survive the ancient one. In the ancient world, fast decisions were survival decisions. Hesitating when a predator charged, or demanding evidence before trusting the alarm calls of your tribe, was a lethal liability. The brain that survived was not the most careful or most rational. It was the fastest and the most socially attuned. We carry that brain with us today into environments that have been deliberately engineered to exploit exactly its characteristics. The first vulnerability is speed. Our brains are designed to reach conclusions before conscious thought catches up. By the time you have rationalized a decision, the decision has often already been made by faster, deeper, older systems. This is why first impressions are sticky, why emotional appeals work faster than logical ones, and why urgency is such an effective manipulation tool. Rush the process, and you short-circuit the part of the brain that might otherwise push back. The second vulnerability is social calibration. We are fundamentally social animals whose survival is always dependent on being accepted by our group. The threat of social exclusion activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. This is not a metaphor. Rejection hurts in the literal neurological sense. This means that social pressure, the sense that everyone else is doing something, that you will be judged for not complying, that belonging requires conformity, bypasses rational analysis almost entirely. It speaks to something older and more urgent than thought. The third vulnerability is cognitive load. Rational thinking is expensive. It requires attention, energy, and time. In states of fatigue, stress, emotional arousal, or information overwhelm, the brain defaults to shortcuts, heuristics, rules of thumb, learned associations. These shortcuts work well enough most of the time, but they are predictable, and predictability is the manipulator's greatest resource. You are not stupid for being vulnerable to manipulation. You are human. And being human means carrying a brain that was shaped by pressures entirely different from the ones you face today. Understanding these vulnerabilities is not an occasion for despair. It is the beginning of your defense. Chapter 2. The Hidden Architecture of Influence. Emotional versus rational decision-making. Here is something the schools rarely teach and the manipulators know very well. You do not make decisions with your rational mind. Your rational mind is a narrator, not a navigator. It constructs stories about decisions that have already been made by systems operating below the threshold of consciousness. By the time you are explaining to yourself, or to someone else, why you chose what you chose, the choice has already been determined. This is not a controversial claim. It is a well-replicated finding across decades of psychological research, confirmed by neuroscience, behavioral economics, and 100,000 careful experiments. The philosopher David Hume came close to grasping it in the 18th century when he wrote that reason is the slave of the passions. Modern neuroscience has essentially confirmed this intuition with far more precision and much better equipment. The emotional system processes information roughly 1,000 times faster than the conscious mind. It reaches conclusions first, encodes those conclusions as feeling. You feel that someone is trustworthy before you've consciously evaluated the evidence. You feel that this is a good deal before you've run the numbers. Manipulators do not target your reasoning. They target your feelings. And by the time your reasoning has been recruited to respond, The feelings have already done their work. This explains why information campaigns so often fail to change behavior. You cannot reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. Showing people data that contradicts an emotionally derived belief does not reliably change the belief. It often strengthens it, in a phenomenon known as the backfire effect. The data is processed by a mind already organized around a feeling, and the mind defends the feeling rather than revising it. To defend against emotional manipulation, you must first accept that you are an emotional decision maker who sometimes applies reason after the fact. This is humbling. It is also essential. The person who believes their decisions are primarily rational is in far greater danger than the person who knows their feelings drive the wheel. Cognitive biases that work against you. The human mind does not process reality directly. It processes a compressed, filtered, distorted model of reality, shaped by attention, memory, expectation, and a library of shortcuts accumulated over a lifetime of learning. These shortcuts are called cognitive biases, and they are not flaws in human thinking. They are features. They allow a brain of limited capacity to navigate an environment of infinite complexity without being paralyzed by the computational demands. But features can be exploited, and cognitive biases are exploited systematically every single day by every sophisticated actor in your environment who wishes to influence your behavior. Consider the availability heuristic. You judge the probability of an event by how easily an example comes to mind. If you can recall a news story about a particular danger, you overestimate its frequency. This is why media organizations that want to influence public perception emphasize certain kinds of stories and suppress others. They are not lying to you. They are shaping what comes to mind, and through that, shaping what feels true. Consider confirmation bias. Once you hold a belief, you process new information in a way that tends to confirm it. You notice evidence that supports your view and discount evidence that contradicts it. This means that first impressions, initial framings, and early-stage persuasion are disproportionately powerful. Get someone to nod yes once and they will be more likely to nod yes again. Get them to accept a premise and they will defend it against challenges they would otherwise find reasonable. Consider the sunk cost fallacy. We continue investing in things, relationships, projects, ideologies, bad decisions, because of what we have already invested, even when the rational course would be to cut our losses. Manipulators know this. They create emotional and material investment before making the ask that matters. By the time the real request arrives, you are already in too deep to easily say no. There are more, dozens more, and they will appear throughout this book as we trace how each manipulation technique targets specific cognitive architecture. For now, the essential insight is this: your biases are known. They have been studied, cataloged, and operationalized by people who wish to influence your behavior. The only defense is to know them yourself, at least as well as they do. The power of repetition and conditioning. There is a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov who became famous for making dogs salivate at the sound of a bell. His work, conducted at the turn of the 20th century, demonstrated something that has since been confirmed and extended in 1,000 different contexts. The brain forms automatic associations between stimuli and responses through repetition, and once formed, those associations operate below conscious awareness. You are not a dog, but your nervous system runs on the same fundamental architecture. Repetition changes the brain at the level of neural circuitry. The more often two things are experienced together, a brand and a feeling of happiness, a political label and a feeling of threat, a person's tone of voice and a feeling of anxiety, the more automatically the association fires. Eventually, the association becomes reflexive. You don't think it, you feel it, before thought has a chance to intervene. This is why advertising works through repetition rather than argument. You do not need to be convinced that a product is good. You need to encounter it often enough, in emotional contexts positive enough, that the association lodges in your nervous system. After that, encountering the brand simply feels pleasant. You are not persuaded, you are conditioned. This is also why propaganda, both political and cultural, relies on repetition above all other techniques. The goal is not to make you believe something through evidence and argument. The goal is to make a belief feel obvious, to repeat a narrative often enough that it stops feeling like a narrative and starts feeling like reality. In your personal life, the same mechanism operates. The family or culture or relationship that told you, repeatedly and from childhood, that you were a particular kind of person, that you were not good with money, or too sensitive, or not as smart as your sibling, did not need to be right to create the effect. They needed to be consistent. Repetition convinced your brain before you were old enough to question it. The question of what you believe about yourself, about others, and about the world is therefore partly a question of what you have been most repeatedly exposed to. And that is a question worth sitting with, uncomfortably for longer than feels comfortable. Chapter 3. The Manipulator's Mindset. What drives manipulative behavior? Before we spend 20 chapters examining manipulation techniques in close detail, it is worth pausing to understand something that most books on this subject skip entirely: the interior life of the person doing the manipulating. This matters for a reason that might not be immediately obvious. If you believe that manipulation is primarily the product of evil people with evil intentions, then your defense becomes a matter of identifying the villains and avoiding them. This strategy will protect you from approximately 10% of the manipulation you experience and leave you defenseless against the other 90%. Because the overwhelming majority of manipulation is not performed by the cold and the calculating. It is performed by the frightened and the needy. People manipulate others when they do not trust that honest communication will give them what they need. This is the root. Whether the manipulation is the sophisticated social engineering of a corporate influencer or the passive-aggressive guilt of a lonely parent, the underlying logic is the same. I need something from you that I don't believe I can get by simply asking. Why don't they simply ask? Sometimes because asking feels too vulnerable. To be direct about needing something means risking a direct refusal, and that refusal would be devastating. Sometimes because they genuinely believe that other people cannot be trusted to respond to honest requests with genuine goodwill. Sometimes because they learned early and thoroughly that the way to get what you need from people is to maneuver them rather than ask them. They were manipulated into their manipulative behaviors. None of this is offered as an excuse. Understanding the psychological roots of manipulation does not make the manipulation acceptable or its effects any less real. But it changes how you see it, and how you see it changes how you respond. The person whose manipulation you recognize as fear-based is not someone to be feared in return. They are someone to be handled with a combination of firmness and understanding. The need for power, control, and advantage. Not all manipulation grows from fear. Some of it grows from appetite. There are individuals, and organizations, and systems for whom control over others is not a defensive measure but a desired state. Power for these actors is not a means to an end. It is the end. And manipulation is simply the most efficient tool for acquiring it. This is the manipulation of the salesperson who doesn't believe in the product but needs the commission. The politician who doesn't believe in the policy but needs the votes. The executive who doesn't care about the people below them but needs their labor. The partner who doesn't experience love as generous but as possessive, who equates control with connection. In these cases, the manipulation is more deliberate, more calculated, more coldly constructed. The manipulator in this mode is not defending against a feared outcome. They are pursuing a desired one. They have identified what they want, assessed what levers are available to pull, and pulled them. Your feelings, your autonomy, and your well-being are variables in their calculation only to the extent that they affect the outcome. Organizations can embody this orientation at scale. A corporation that employs behavioral scientists not to improve their product, but to engineer compulsive use, is not making a mistake. It is making a choice. A political party that uses psychological profiling, not to communicate more clearly, but to divide and inflame, is not being unsophisticated. It is being ruthlessly strategic. The power-seeking institution and the power-seeking individual operate by the same logic, just with greater resources and more elaborate machinery. Recognizing this type of manipulation requires a different posture than recognizing the fear-based variety. Here, warmth and understanding are less useful than clear-eyed distance and structural thinking. What does this actor gain from my compliance? What happens to their position if I say no? These are the questions that illuminate power-driven manipulation, not feelings. Architecture. Recognizing intent via impact. Here is one of the most important concepts in this entire book, and one of the most consistently misunderstood. The intent of the manipulator and the impact of the manipulation are separate facts that must be assessed separately. The intent question is, did they mean to do it? The impact question is, did it happen to me? These questions have different answers more often than people realize. You can be manipulated by someone who loves you and wishes you well. You can be manipulated by someone who has no conscious awareness that they are doing anything at all. The absence of malicious intent does not undo the fact that your autonomy has been circumvented, and your behavior has been shaped by mechanisms you did not choose. This distinction matters practically, because people frequently stop their analysis of manipulation at the intent question. They ask, would this person want to hurt me? They answer, probably not. And then they conclude, therefore I am not being manipulated. This reasoning has a fatal flaw. It treats intent as the relevant variable, when impact is the thing you actually need to defend against. The reverse error also exists and is equally costly. People sometimes attribute sinister intent to manipulation that is entirely unconscious, and this causes them to respond with hostility, accusation, and defensiveness that destroys relationships and conversations that could otherwise have been navigated. You accuse someone of deliberately controlling you. They are genuinely bewildered because in their model of themselves, they were simply expressing care or concern or love. The accusation feels unjust to them, and in some sense it is, because it assigns conscious malice where there was only conditioned behavior. The clean approach separates the questions entirely. First, is my autonomy being circumvented? This is a factual question about mechanisms, not intentions. Second, what response does this require? The answer to the second question will depend partly on intent. Knowing someone is acting unconsciously changes how you address the behavior. But the first question must be answered accurately, before the second one can even be asked. Intention is morally relevant. It is not psychologically protective. The manipulation still worked, whether they meant it or not. Part 2. The 20 Daily Manipulation Secrets. Secret 1. The illusion of choice. How options are engineered to control decisions. You believe you made a choice today. You almost certainly did not. This is not a dramatic claim. It is simply an accurate one. The illusion of choice is among the most elegant and most pervasive manipulation techniques in existence, precisely because it generates exactly the psychological feeling of autonomy, the sense that you have decided freely, while actually channeling your behavior through a carefully designed set of options that all lead to the same destination. The mechanism works like this. When you are given options, your brain's attention shifts from the question of whether to comply to the question of which option to choose. This is a profound and underappreciated shift. The option giver has, at the moment of offering you a choice, already answered the most important question, the question you should be asking on your behalf. The question is not which option. The question is whether any of these options serves your actual interests. Consider how this operates in the retail environment. You walk into a store intending to buy a shirt. You are shown 3 options at 3 price points. Your mind, presented with a genuine comparison, begins evaluating the options against each other. The most common psychological outcome is that you purchase the middle option, not because it is objectively the best value, but because it feels balanced. It avoids the apparent extravagance of the most expensive option and the apparent compromise of the cheapest. This phenomenon, called compromise effect, is so reliable that product designers deliberately construct pricing architectures around it. The expensive option isn't there because they expect to sell many of them. It's there to make the middle option feel reasonable. The options were designed. The selection was predicted. What feels like your choice was a funnel.
This technique operates not only in commerce, but in every domain where someone wishes to direct your behavior while preserving your sense of agency. Political discourse is structured as a binary. You choose between this side or that side, while the question of whether this framing serves your interest is never raised. Workplace decisions are presented as choices between two approaches, while the option of not doing the task at all, or doing it a third way, is never mentioned. Relationship dynamics offer you the choice between compliance and conflict, never acknowledging that there might be a third option called honest renegotiation. The deep structure of the illusion of choice is always the same. Here are your options, choose wisely, the choice is yours. What is never said is, we designed these options and all of them lead where we needed you to go. How do you defend against this? The first and most powerful step is to pause before engaging with the offered options and ask a prior question. Who constructed this menu and why? Every set of options was chosen by someone from a larger universe of possible options. What is not on the menu? What option is conspicuously absent? What would you choose if you were designing the menu yourself? The second step is to notice the feeling of relief that comes when you select an option. That relief is often the emotional signature of the illusion working as intended. You feel like you've made a decision and can relax. But that relief should be a signal, not a reward. Ask yourself, relief that what is over, the consideration of whether to comply at all? That question never got answered. The third step, and this requires practice, is to regularly generate options that were not offered to you. When someone gives you a choice between A and B, ask yourself, what would C look like? D, what if I did nothing? What if I changed the terms entirely? The ability to generate options outside the offered set is one of the most powerful cognitive tools available to you, and it is one that sophisticated actors spend enormous resources trying to atrophy. You are being funneled through choices that feel like freedom. The walls of the funnel are invisible, but once you know they're there, you can reach past them. The question that no one wants you to ask, the question whose absence is itself a form of control, is the simplest one. Who decided what my options are, and what options did they decide not to give me? Ask it every time. The answer will change things. Secret 2. Emotional triggers, fear, guilt, and desire as control tools. The three most powerful levers in the manipulator's toolkit are older than civilization. They do not require sophisticated technology, educational credentials, or elaborate social architecture. They are simply feelings, fear, guilt, and desire. And they are so fundamental to the human experience, so deeply wired into the nervous system, that they bypass rational analysis with a reliability that more complex techniques cannot match. Fear is the oldest. In evolutionary terms, fear is the alarm system that kept your ancestors alive when the world was full of predators. It narrows attention, accelerates decision-making, and suppresses the kind of deliberate analytical thinking that might otherwise slow down a survival response. Fear is the neurological equivalent of an emergency override. It takes the wheel and demands you act now. This is precisely why it is so useful to those who want to control your behavior without your deliberate consent. Fear-based manipulation doesn't have to be subtle. It just has to be believed. When you are afraid, you make decisions under a logic that prioritizes threat elimination above almost everything else. Above long-term consequences, above your own values, above relationships, above evidence. The person or institution that can make you afraid and then offer you a solution to the fear has placed themselves in a position of extraordinary power. Advertising has understood this for a century. You are aging, and here is the product that will slow it. You are not enough, and here is the brand that will complete you. Your children are vulnerable, and here is the insurance that will protect them. The fear does not need to be realistic. It needs to be felt. Once it is felt, the rational mind is largely out of the game, and the solution that was always waiting can step forward. Political manipulation has understood this even longer. Populations under threat are compliant. Populations that believe they face an imminent existential danger will surrender freedoms they would never surrender in calmer time. Every era of authoritarian consolidation has been accompanied by the amplification of fear, of outsiders, of enemies, of change, of the destruction of everything familiar and good. The fear is the first product. The control is what it purchases. Guilt operates through a different mechanism, but with comparable effectiveness. Where fear says you are in danger, guilt says you are wrong. It targets the deeply human need for self-approval and the approval of others, and it exploits the well-documented human tendency to prioritize avoiding negative states over achieving positive ones. The feeling of guilt, of having failed, of being inadequate, of owing something, is deeply aversive, and people will do a great deal to make it stop. The master of guilt manipulation understands that you do not need to have done anything wrong for guilt to function. You simply need to believe that you have, and belief can be engineered. A parent who says, "I sacrificed so much for you," which then hangs unfinished in the air, is engineering guilt without making an explicit accusation. A partner who responds to your needs with a tired sigh is generating guilt without stating a complaint. A culture that tells you your normal human limitations make you a bad person is running guilt as a background program in your nervous system, shaping your behavior in ways you may not consciously register. Desire is the third lever, and it is perhaps the most insidious, because it feels like pleasure. Fear and guilt are unpleasant. They can be recognized as coercion even from the inside. Desire feels like want, like motivation, like enthusiasm. And yet desire manufactured and directed externally is no different in its mechanism from fear and guilt. Your behavior is being shaped by an emotional state that was deliberately induced for someone else's benefit. The desire manipulation tells you you are not enough, but you could be. You are not there yet, but with this you will be. It targets the perennial human experience of incompleteness, the sense that the right object, the right relationship, the right achievement, the right appearance would finally make you whole. It sells you the feeling of that future wholeness in advance as a product. Defense against emotional trigger manipulation requires what may be the most difficult of all psychological skills: the ability to feel an emotion clearly and simultaneously to observe it without being entirely consumed by it. You feel the fear. You note that you are feeling the fear. You ask, what produced this feeling, and in whose interest is it that I feel this way right now? The few seconds between feeling and acting are everything. In those seconds, you move from subject to observer, from target to strategist. Your emotions are not errors, they are information. But they are information that can be hacked, and knowing that changes everything about how you read them. Secret 3. Social proof pressure. Why you follow the crowd without realizing. The human brain did not evolve to think alone. For the vast majority of human history, the group was survival, and survival was the group. To think differently from your tribe, to act differently, to hold beliefs that marked you as outside the consensus. These were not merely uncomfortable, they were potentially fatal. Exclusion from the group meant exposure to everything the group protected against: predator, starvation, cold, violence. This history lives in your nervous system. It is why, when you discover that your opinion differs from everyone else in the room, something in you wants to reconsider. Not because the others provided new evidence, not because they made a compelling argument, simply because they are all pointing in the same direction, and something ancient and frightened in you reads unanimity as a signal that you might be dangerously wrong. Social proof is the manipulation technique that exploits this instinct at scale. It says, look at everyone else. Look at how many people have bought this product, adopted this belief, engaged in this behavior. Are you really going to be the one who doesn't? The technique works not because of any information it conveys about the quality or validity of the thing in question, but because of what it implies about the social cost of refusal. What makes social proof particularly powerful and particularly dangerous is that it functions even when we know it's being manufactured. Studies have shown that people are influenced by apparent social consensus even when they suspect the consensus has been artificially constructed. The emotional pull of not being outside the group is so deep that intellectual skepticism doesn't fully neutralize it. You can know that the 5-star reviews were curated and still feel their pull. You can know that the studio audience's laughter was prompted and still find the show funnier. You can know that the social media numbers were gamed and still assign them implicit credibility. This is the genius and the horror of manufactured consensus at scale. When millions of people appear to hold the same view, when that view is visible everywhere, on every screen, in every conversation, in every piece of content the algorithm serves you, the view begins to feel true, not because it has been proven, but because ubiquity feels like evidence. And ubiquity can be manufactured. Cults understand this. So do authoritarian governments. So do consumer brands. So do social media platforms, which discovered that making certain content visible reinforces its apparent popularity, which reinforces its actual popularity, which reinforces its visibility. A self-amplifying loop that has almost nothing to do with the intrinsic value or truth of the content, and everything to do with the architecture of the system. The defense against social proof manipulation has two components. The first is to disentangle the question of popularity from the question of validity. These are simply different questions. How many people believe something tells you nothing reliable about whether that something is true? It tells you only that many people believe it, which may say more about how they were exposed to it than about its merits. The second component is to practice what might be called principled heterodoxy, the deliberate, calm tolerance of holding views and making choices that differ from the apparent consensus. This is harder than it sounds. The social discomfort of being different is genuine, and dismissing it as weakness doesn't make it go away. The goal is not to be automatically contrarian. That is simply social proof operating in reverse, defining yourself by opposition to the group. The goal is to let your assessment of the evidence be genuinely independent of how many other people appear to share it. When you feel the pull to conform, when the thought appears that everyone else seems to be doing this, so maybe I should too, pause. Ask, what do I actually think about this? If I bracket what other people seem to think, what would I choose if no one was watching? If the answer is different from what you are about to do, you have just caught social proof in the act. Secret 4. Authority influence. The hidden power of titles and perceived expertise. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments that disturbed the world so profoundly that the ethical guidelines for human subjects research were substantially rewritten as a result. Milgram wanted to know how far ordinary people would go in harming others if instructed to do so by an authority figure. The answer, confirmed across dozens of replications in different countries and contexts, was much farther than anyone wanted to believe. Ordinary people, teachers, accountants, factory workers, students, administered what they believed were painful and potentially lethal electric shocks to screaming strangers. Because a man in a white coat told them to continue. They expressed distress. They questioned the instructions, but they continued. The authority was not real power. The man in the white coat had no enforcement mechanism. He could not actually compel anyone. He could only create the feeling of legitimate authority, and that feeling was enough. Authority manipulation works through a simple mechanism. Human beings are deeply conditioned from childhood to defer to expertise. This makes evolutionary sense. If you know nothing about which plants are poisonous, and someone who has studied plants for 20 years tells you not to eat a particular berry, deference is rational. Deferring to expertise conserves cognitive resources and leverages the accumulated knowledge of those who have invested more time in a domain than you have. In its legitimate form, respect for authority is a sensible social technology. But authority can be performed without being earned. The white coat is a symbol, and symbols can be worn by anyone. The title can be purchased, invented, or simply claimed. The confident tone of expertise can be adopted independently of any actual expertise. The institutional affiliation can be real and still be irrelevant. The credential can be genuine in a narrow domain and then extended to questions far outside it. Celebrity endorsement is the crudest form of this. A famous face in a medical context, implying expertise that has nothing to do with their fame. But subtler versions are everywhere. The confident, well-dressed consultant who speaks in the language of the industry. The anonymous researcher who is cited in an article whose methodology no one has examined. The online commentator whose follower count is used as a proxy for insight. The manager whose positional authority is treated as intellectual authority. In each case, the form of expertise, the signals, the costume, the context, is doing the work that actual expertise would otherwise do. The defense against authority manipulation is not to become reflexively anti-authority. Expertise exists, and deferring to it is sometimes genuinely wise. The question is not whether this person has authority, but whether this person's authority is relevant, earned, and applicable to the specific question at hand. Ask, what is this person's authority based on? Is it a title, a credential, a tone, or demonstrable track record? Is their expertise in this specific domain or in an adjacent one? What would they have to gain from my compliance? Is their advice designed to inform my judgment or to replace it? The last question is perhaps the most important. Genuine expertise aims to increase your capacity to decide, to give you information, frameworks, and understanding that improve your own judgment. Authority manipulation aims to short-circuit your judgment entirely, to make you feel that your own assessment is unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Real experts are comfortable with your questions. Those wearing the costume of authority often are not. Secret 5. Scarcity tactics, limited time, and only a few left strategies. There is a thing that happens in the human brain when something becomes rare. The same object that produced mild interest a moment ago suddenly becomes urgently desirable. The same opportunity that seemed worth considering at leisure must now be seized immediately. Nothing about the object or opportunity has changed. What has changed is only its apparent availability, and that apparent change has completely transformed your relationship to it. This is the scarcity effect, and it is hardwired deeply enough into human cognition that it operates independently of any rational assessment of the thing's actual value. You don't need to have particularly wanted something in order for the news that it's almost gone to make you want it intensely. The scarcity is itself the generator of desire. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. In an environment of genuine resource scarcity, which describes virtually all of human history until approximately the last century, the creature that moved quickly when resources became rare survived better than the creature that deliberated. The fruit that was almost gone would be entirely gone if you waited. The maid who had other suitors would be claimed if you hesitated. The scarcity signal evolved as a genuine, meaningful cue. Act now, this matters, because acting now genuinely mattered. Today, the signal is routinely manufactured by entities that have studied its effect on behavior and found it reliable. The countdown timer on the e-commerce page. The only 3 left in stock notification that appears no matter how many times you reload the page. The sale ends tonight. That ends tonight and begins again tomorrow morning. The exclusive offer that everyone in the target demographic received. The limited edition product that ships in quantities of several 100,000. None of these are lies in the simple sense. The timer is real. The offer does technically have an end date, even if a new one begins the moment it does. The edition is technically limited to a specific production run. But the function of these communications is not to give you accurate information about availability. The function is to activate the scarcity response in your nervous system. to create the feeling of urgency, which bypasses deliberative thinking, which makes you more likely to act before you have fully assessed whether acting serves your interests. The technique extends beyond commerce. Relationship manipulators use scarcity constantly. Other people want me, and I could have them instead of you. Political actors use scarcity. This is the last election, the last chance, the final opportunity to prevent a catastrophic outcome. Social dynamics are shaped by scarcity. The invitation is only open until the end of the week. In each case, the mechanism is identical. Manufacture urgency, short-circuit reflection, produce compliance. What makes scarcity manipulation particularly difficult to defend against is that scarcity is sometimes real. Resources are sometimes genuinely limited. Opportunities do sometimes close. Relationships are sometimes genuinely threatened by inaction. The manipulation is not that scarcity is always a lie. It's that scarcity, real or manufactured, is used as a reason to stop thinking rather than to think more carefully. The defense is therefore not to be unmoved by scarcity, but to be deliberate about how you respond to it. When you feel the urgency that scarcity produces, it is a signal to slow down, not to speed up. Ask, is this scarcity genuine or manufactured? Can I verify it independently? If I miss this opportunity, what actually happens? And would that outcome be as devastating as it now feels? What would I decide about this if I had a week to think about it? The final question is the most powerful. If this opportunity cannot survive careful consideration, was it ever really an opportunity worth taking? Secret 6. Reciprocity Trap. The psychology of feeling indebted. There is a social principle so fundamental to human culture, so universally observed across every society ever studied, that anthropologists regard it as one of the defining features of civilization. If someone gives you something, you should give something back. Reciprocity is the foundation of social cooperation. It makes trust possible between strangers. It allows communities to share resources across time, lending in seasons of plenty and borrowing in seasons of need. Without reciprocity, the complex web of mutual obligation that makes organized society function would unravel. It is not merely a social convention. It is in a deep sense what society is, and it is one of the most frequently and systematically exploited principles in the entire landscape of manipulation. The reciprocity trap begins with a gift. Something given to you, often unsolicited, that creates a sense of obligation before you have had a chance to consider whether you wanted the relationship it implies. The free sample at the supermarket. The complimentary upgrade you didn't ask for. The small favor done before the large request is made. The holiday gift from the salesperson you've been trying to disengage from. In each case, something has been given to you, and the social rules of reciprocity, rules so deeply internalized that violating them causes genuine psychological discomfort, have been activated. The asymmetry is what makes this a trap. The thing given to you need not be equivalent in value to what you are being positioned to give in return. You can be primed toward a $1,000 commitment by a $10 gift. The transaction logic of commerce does not apply here. You are not being asked to respond rationally to fair value. You are being asked to respond emotionally to the feeling of indebtedness, and that feeling is not calibrated to monetary value. It is calibrated to the social fact of having received something. Charities discovered this decades ago, sending small, unsolicited gifts, address labels, calendars, stickers, with donation requests dramatically increases donation rates compared to sending the same request without a gift. Donors feel obligated to reciprocate, even when they did not ask for the gift, even when they did not particularly want it. The gift has already activated the social calculus of reciprocity, and declining to respond requires overriding a deeply conditioned social reflex. The same principle operates in interpersonal manipulation at every level of intimacy. The person who does you an unrequested favor, and then, later, holds the memory of it, over the request they were always planning to make. The romantic partner who makes extravagant gestures early in the relationship, establishing a pattern of apparent generosity that creates obligation before the controlling behavior begins. The colleague who helps you with a project you didn't need help with, and then calls in the favor at a moment chosen for its strategic inconvenience to you. Defending against reciprocity manipulation requires a conceptual distinction that most people find uncomfortable. There is a difference between genuine gifts and strategic investments made in your name without your consent. A genuine gift is given without expectation of return. A reciprocity trap is an advance payment for a future compliance, delivered in the form of a gift to prevent you from evaluating it as the purchase it actually is. You are under no obligation to repay an investment you did not authorize. The free sample was not a gift to you. It was an investment in your compliance, made by an entity that calculated the return in advance. You are allowed to accept it and walk away without guilt, because the guilt is not a sign that you owe something. It is simply the reciprocity mechanism doing what it was designed to do. It can be acknowledged and set aside. Secret 7. Gaslighting. How reality is distorted to control perception. The term comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she is losing her mind. He moves objects and denies having moved them. He dims the gas-powered lights and denies that they've changed. He responds to her accurate perceptions with concern, with gentle correction, with a soft implication that something is wrong with her ability to perceive reality correctly. The film was fiction. The technique it dramatized is not. Gaslighting is the deliberate, or sometimes unwitting, distortion of another person's perception of reality in order to make them doubt their own judgment, memory, or sanity. It is manipulation at the most fundamental level, not the manipulation of decisions or behaviors, but the manipulation of the very ground from which decisions and behaviors emerge. It does not tell you what to want. It corrupts your ability to know what you know. In its most overt form, gaslighting involves direct denials of observable reality. That never happened. You're imagining things. I never said that. You're remembering it wrong. When these denials are delivered with sufficient confidence by a person in a position of authority or intimacy, they produce a devastating psychological effect. The victim is confronted with a split between their own clear perception and the reality being asserted by someone they are supposed to trust. Under sustained pressure, many people resolve this split by doubting themselves rather than doubting the person asserting the alternative reality. But gaslighting does not require explicit denial. It can operate through subtler distortions, responding to your expressed feeling with an account of why your feeling is irrational, reinterpreting your memory of events in a way that systematically favors the manipulator's version, responding to your concerns with questions about your psychological stability, creating an environment in which your accurate perceptions are so consistently met with contradiction that you stop trusting them entirely. The truly insidious quality of gaslighting is that its effectiveness scales with intimacy and dependency. The more you rely on someone, for material needs, for emotional security, for your sense of self, the more credible their assertions about your reality become relative to your own. A stranger who told you that you were remembering something incorrectly would be easily dismissed. A parent, a partner, a close friend, an employer. Someone with intimate access to your history, your vulnerabilities, your need to be right with them, is far harder to disbelieve. Defense against gaslighting requires what is perhaps the most difficult thing in this entire book: trusting your own perceptions, even when a trusted person tells you they are wrong. This does not mean never revising your understanding of events or accepting feedback. It means maintaining what might be called perceptual self-respect. The fundamental conviction that your experience is real and worthy of being taken seriously. The most practical defensive tool is documentation. Writing down your experiences and perceptions as they occur, not after the fact, Memory is genuinely fallible and genuinely susceptible to retroactive revision. If you have a written record, you have something to return to when your memory is being disputed. This is not paranoia. It is the maintenance of an accurate relationship with your own experience. If you find yourself repeatedly apologizing for perceptions you were confident in before a conversation began, repeatedly discovering that your memory of events is wrong in ways that always seem to favor the other person, repeatedly feeling as though something is slightly off about your sense of reality, but unable to name exactly what, pay attention to that feeling. It is trying to tell you something important. Secret 8. Framing reality. How wording shapes your decisions. Two surgeons are asked to describe a procedure to their patients. The first says, "With this operation, there is a 10% chance of death." The second says, "With this operation, there is a 90% chance of survival." The information is mathematically identical. The emotional impact is not. The patients who hear the first description are measurably less likely to choose the operation. This is framing, and it is operating on your decisions every hour of every day. Framing is the selection of a particular perspective, emphasis, or linguistic structure to present information in a way that predictably influences how it is received and evaluated. The information itself does not change. What changes is the cognitive and emotional context in which it is processed. And that context changes everything. The label attached to something determines, more than the thing itself, how it is experienced. Pro-life and anti-abortion describe the same position and produce measurably different emotional responses. Freedom fighter and terrorist are applied to the same person based not on their actions, but on the political allegiance of the speaker. Ethnic cleansing is a frame applied to what is, without the frame, mass murder. The frame is doing profound political work while appearing merely to describe. In personal relationships, framing is the invisible architecture of every difficult conversation. The difference between, "You never support me, and I feel unsupported in this," is not merely stylistic. It produces fundamentally different psychological responses, and therefore different conversational outcomes. The difference between, "We need to talk," ominous, undefined, producing anxiety, and "I wanted to check in about something," neutral, bounded, manageable, is a framing choice that shapes the emotional register of everything that follows. In commerce, framing is so pervasive that it is essentially the discipline of marketing. A product is not simply described, it is positioned. That positioning determines not only how the product is perceived, but who perceives themselves as the kind of person who would buy it. The most successful consumer brands don't sell products, they sell identities, and the frame is the identity. You don't buy a certain automobile because you have evaluated its mechanical properties against the competition. You buy it because the frame says, "The kind of person you want to be drives this car." Media and political communication are built on framing at industrial scale. Which events are covered and which are not is a framing decision. What language is used to describe the covered events is a framing decision. What context is provided or withheld is a framing decision. The story isn't just in what is said, it is overwhelmingly in how it is said and what is not said. Defending against framing manipulation requires what might be called frame awareness, the habit of noticing that a frame is being applied before you evaluate the thing itself. When you encounter a characterization of something, a political policy, a product, a person, a situation, ask, who chose this frame? What alternative frames exist? How would this look from a different framing? What is the frame designed to make me feel? And does the feeling match what I would feel if I encountered the underlying facts without their interpretive packaging? This is not an invitation to nihilism, to the position that all frames are equally valid, and therefore nothing can be evaluated. Some frames are more accurate than others. Accuracy is a real standard, even in a world of ubiquitous framing. But accuracy can only be assessed if you are aware that a frame is present. The frame that feels like reality. The frame that has been so successfully normalized that it no longer appears as a choice is the most dangerous one of all. Secret 9. Information overload. Confusion as a manipulation strategy. There is a moment known to everyone who has tried to read a software license agreement, understand a financial product disclosure, or parse the terms and conditions of a service they want to use. The moment when the volume and complexity of the information tips into something that feels less like the communication and more like obstruction. The words are technically there. They are technically information, but they are presented in a quantity, a density, and a register that makes actual comprehension effectively impossible for any normal person operating under normal constraints of time and attention. This is not an accident. Information overload as a manipulation strategy operates on a simple premise. A confused person defaults to someone else's judgment. When the information required to make an informed decision is technically available, but practically inaccessible, buried in complexity, scattered across too many sources, presented in too little time, or simply overwhelming in sheer volume, the rational response to confusion takes over. You hand the decision to whoever seems most confident, most authoritative, or most immediately available, which by design is the party that manufactured the confusion in the first place. The financial services industry has mastered this technique. The complexity of investment products, insurance policies, mortgage structures, and fee arrangements is in principle a function of the genuine complexity of financial instruments. In practice, it is also a function of the fact that simplicity would allow customers to make accurate comparisons and recognize when they are being poorly served. Complexity is profitable. It is therefore preserved and sometimes amplified beyond what genuine product complexity requires. Healthcare decision-making is frequently overwhelmed by the same mechanism, not necessarily by malicious design in each case, but by the structural reality that the information asymmetry between patient and provider is enormous, and the environment is too rushed and too technically demanding for most patients to bridge it. The result is that patients frequently defer to the most confident voice in the room, independent of whether that confidence is warranted. Political communication uses information overload deliberately and skillfully. The news environment that produces too many stories to track, too many crises to assess, too many claims and counterclaims to evaluate, is an environment that produces political passivity and easy manipulation. When everything feels equally urgent and equally uncertain, the emotional shortcuts of tribalism and authority take over from individual judgment. This outcome benefits those who are most effective at activating tribal loyalties and projecting authority. In personal relationships, information overload takes the form of excessive explanation, circular reasoning, and the sustained introduction of complications and qualifications that make it impossible to maintain a clear position. You begin a conversation with a clear sense of your concern. 20 minutes later, you have been taken on a tour of so many tangents, so many counterexamples, so many complications and provisos, that your original concern is no longer visible. You are lost in a forest of detail, unable to remember where you entered or why. The defense is radical simplicity. Before any complex interaction, write down in 1 or 2 sentences what you need to understand or decide. Write down what a satisfactory answer would look like. When you find yourself lost in complexity, return to these sentences. They are your anchor. The confusion cannot reach them. Asking for simplification is not a sign of inadequacy. It is a defense against a technique that relies on complexity to disable your judgment. If someone cannot explain the essential point simply, ask yourself whether the complexity is genuine or constructed. Sometimes the honest answer is that they don't understand it themselves. Sometimes the honest answer is that they prefer you don't. Secret 10. Anchoring effect. First impressions that trap your judgment. The first number you see is not merely the first number. It is the number that all subsequent numbers will be measured against. This is the anchoring effect, one of the most reliably documented phenomena in cognitive psychology, and it operates with a consistency and a power that continues to surprise even researchers who have spent careers studying it. In a classic demonstration, subjects are asked whether the percentage of African nations in the United Nations is higher or lower than a number generated by spinning a wheel, a number that is openly acknowledged to be random. When the wheel shows 10, subjects' subsequent guesses cluster around 25. When the wheel shows 65, their guesses cluster around 45. The random number, despite being meaningless and despite subjects knowing it's random, anchors their estimates and pulls them toward itself. Irrelevant, arbitrary information changes the judgment of people who know it's irrelevant and arbitrary. This should disturb you, and it should illuminate something about every negotiation, every purchase, every first impression you have ever formed. In negotiation, the party that sets the first number has a structural advantage that cannot be entirely overcome by rational analysis. The initial offer, however unreasonable, establishes the reference point around which the negotiation orbits. A high opening price makes the eventual agreed price feel like a win for the buyer, regardless of whether it was actually favorable. A low initial estimate of a project's value anchors the subsequent discussion below where it would otherwise have landed. The first number is not a mere opener. It is an architectural decision that shapes everything that follows. Consumer pricing is built almost entirely on anchor manipulation. The crossed-out original price on the sale tag exists for one reason: to create an anchor against which the sale price will be favorably compared. Whether the original price was ever real is largely irrelevant. It has done its work. You evaluate the sale price not against what the item is worth, but against the number that has been placed in your visual field. The anchor has defined the frame. First impressions in interpersonal contexts operate by the same mechanism. The first characterization you receive of a person, from a mutual acquaintance, from a professional reputation, from their opening statement in a meeting, anchors your subsequent perception in ways that subsequent information struggles to dislodge. Positive anchors cause you to interpret ambiguous subsequent behavior charitably. Negative anchors cause you to interpret it suspiciously. The information you process first does not merely inform your judgment. It becomes the standard against which everything else is measured. This is why first contact is so important to sophisticated social manipulators. The impression established at the beginning of a relationship can be strategically constructed to create an anchor of trustworthiness, generosity, or expertise that will shade your interpretation of their behavior for a very long time. By the time the behavior that contradicts the initial impression appears, you have built substantial cognitive infrastructure around the anchor, and disassembling that infrastructure is psychologically costly. Defense against anchoring requires, above all, the discipline of asking the prior question. What is my independent assessment before I engage with the offered reference point? In a negotiation, know your number before you hear theirs. In a relationship, develop your own impressions before you are briefed by someone else. Before you see the sale price, ask what you would pay for this item if you had never seen an original price. The anchor only works because it's the first thing. Take the time to establish your own first thing. Secret 11. Micro-commitments. Small yeses that lead to big control. Imagine being approached on the street and asked to donate $1,000 to a charity you've never heard of. Your answer would almost certainly be no, quickly, firmly, and without much deliberation. Now imagine being asked to sign a petition about an issue you vaguely support. You sign. A week later, you're asked to wear a badge supporting the cause. You wear it. A month later, you're asked to volunteer for an afternoon. 6 months later, you find yourself writing a substantial check to an organization you would have dismissed entirely if they had opened with that request. This is the foot in the door technique, and it is one of the most elegantly constructed manipulation architectures ever systematically studied. The mechanism underlying it is one of psychology's most important insights about human self-concept. We are highly motivated to behave in ways consistent with our prior behavior and with the identity we have constructed around it. Once you have said yes, even to a small, seemingly inconsequential thing, you have established a behavioral precedent and, more importantly, an identity implication. You are now the kind of person who supports this cause, and being the kind of person who supports this cause creates pressure, internal and external, to continue supporting it in ways proportionate to the apparent commitment level of someone who genuinely supports it. The commitment doesn't need to be public to be powerful, though public commitments are more powerful than private ones because they engage additional social dynamic. Even a private commitment, a decision you have made to yourself, a choice you have recorded in your own behavior, creates an identity structure that subsequent decisions will be measured against. Having decided once, you feel the pull to decide consistently. Sophisticated operators understand that large asks should never come first. The entire architecture of a relationship, personal, commercial, political, can be constructed as a series of escalating micro-commitments, each small enough to feel costless, each building the identity structure that makes the next commitment feel natural. By the time the significant ask arrives, you have been saying yes for so long that saying no would require dismantling the narrative you have constructed about who you are. This is one reason why cults are not joined in a single dramatic moment. They are joined through a series of small engagements, an interesting conversation, an inviting event, a helpful community, a set of ideas that resonate in a specific moment of vulnerability, each of which binds the person slightly more securely to the identity of someone who is exploring this community, and then part of this community, and then committed to this community, and then someone whose identity is inseparable from this community. Political radicalization follows the same gradient. Extreme beliefs are rarely adopted in a single leap. They are approached through a series of positions, each slightly more extreme than the last, each positioning the more extreme direction as the logical extension of the commitment already made. The defense is consistency auditing, the regular practice of asking yourself whether the commitments you are accumulating reflect choices you would make deliberately, or whether they are the products of an escalation you didn't consciously choose. This requires the psychological courage to be inconsistent when consistency is being used against you. It is possible to say, I said yes before, and I am saying no now. And these are both honest expressions of where I am. The idea that past yeses obligate future yeses is the mechanism of the trap. Seeing it clearly is how you step out. Secret 12. Fear amplification. How fear is used to override logic. There is a difference between fear and fear amplification. Natural fear is a response to a genuine threat, a signal that something in your environment requires urgent attention. It is calibrated more or less to the actual magnitude of the threat. It is useful. Fear amplification is the deliberate inflation of fear beyond what the actual threat warrants, for the purpose of producing behaviors that the amplified state generates, but the actual threat level would not. This distinction is crucial because fear amplification works by piggybacking on the legitimacy of real fear. It takes real threats, aging, illness, economic uncertainty, social instability, violence, rejection, and inflates their probability, their imminence, or their magnitude beyond the evidence. The fear that results is genuine and is processed by the nervous system as genuine, but the behavioral responses it drives are calibrated to the inflated threat, not the real one. The result is behavior that serves the interests of those who manufactured the inflation, not the interests of the person who is afraid. Consider health anxiety as a consumer phenomenon. The health and wellness industry has a structural incentive to make you feel less healthy than you are. not because your actual health cannot generate revenue, but because your health anxiety can generate far more. The advertisement that shows you a graph of declining health marker over time, accompanied by ominous music, and the concerned faces of people who did not act in time, is not reporting your health status. It is calibrating your fear upward in preparation for a product that addresses the amplified threat. Political fear amplification follows the same structure but with higher stakes. The threat is real. Some version of the problem being described exists, but its magnitude, probability, and the proximity of catastrophe are inflated past the point that evidence warrants. The inflation serves to produce in the population a level of alarm that the actual threat would not generate. An alarm at that level produces behaviors: compliance, surrender of rights, support for extraordinary measures, dehumanization of identified threats that calmer evaluation would reject. This is not hypothetical. It is the most common mechanism of democratic backsliding in the historical record. Populations whose fear is sustained at high intensity for long enough become susceptible to authoritarian solutions that they would have recognized as authoritarian in a less frightened state. The fear is the key that opens the lock. In personal relationships, fear amplification is the tool of the controlling partner, the overprotective parent, the manipulative friend. If I can make you afraid enough of the world, of your own inadequacy, of what will happen to you without me, of what others think of you, then my control over you feels like protection. The person who says, "I'm only telling you this because I'm worried about you," is often amplifying your fear of the very thing they claim to be protecting you from. The fear is the leash. Amplifying it tightens the leash. The defense requires regular calibration, the deliberate practice of assessing the evidence for a threat independently of the emotional intensity with which it is being presented. How likely is this outcome actually? What does the data say if I bracket the emotional presentation? What would I decide about this if I had a week to think about it calmly? Who benefits if I act from this level of fear? Would I reach the same conclusion if I were not afraid? Fear is trying to serve you. When it has been amplified beyond what the evidence warrants, it is serving someone else. Secret 13. Identity manipulation. Controlling who you believe you are. Who are you? The question sounds simple. The answer, if you examine it honestly, is more complicated than you might wish. Much of what you believe about yourself, your capabilities, your character, your limitations, your role in the world, your worth, was not arrived at through independent assessment. It was told to you repeatedly by people and institutions whose interests were served by the version of you that their description produced. This is identity manipulation, and it operates at the deepest level of the self. We are, as social beings, profoundly susceptible to the identities others assign us. This is not weakness. It is how development works. The infant has no self-concept. The child builds one from the reflections provided by caregivers, siblings, teachers, peers, and culture. The process is necessary and largely unavoidable. The problem arises when the identities assigned in that process serve the needs of the assigner more than the development of the child, and when those assigned identities harden into self-limiting beliefs that persist long past the circumstances that generated them. You are not good with numbers. Oh, you are too sensitive. You are the difficult one. You are the responsible one, which means you are not allowed to need anything. You are not as smart as your sibling. You are too much. You are not enough. You are the kind of person who fails, panics, gives up, cannot be trusted, will not change. These are not observations. They are identity installations, and they are running in your operating system right now, shaping your behavior in ways you may attribute to personality rather than to their actual source. External manipulation of identity continues well past childhood. The military understands identity transformation as a core technology. Strip the individual identity. Install a collective one, and you have produced someone capable of behaviors the original person would never have contemplated. Cults operate by the same mechanism at lower intensity. The corporate culture that tells employees they are a family, not employees in an exchange relationship, but family, is manipulating identity to extract commitment beyond what the transactional relationship would otherwise produce. Consumer culture manipulates identity through aspiration. You are not the person you want to be yet, but you could be, and this brand is the vehicle. The purchase is identity work. You are not buying a product. You are buying evidence that you are the kind of person who has this product. And that person is better than you are now. The manipulative element is the gap that must be maintained. The aspired identity can never be fully achieved through consumption, because the achievement would end the need. The gap is the product. Defending against identity manipulation requires what might be called identity authorship, the deliberate practice of examining your self-concept and asking which elements you arrived at through your own experience and reflection, and which were installed by others for purposes that had nothing to do with your flourishing. This is the work of a lifetime and never fully finished. But the practice itself, the habit of asking, who told me this about myself, and why did they need me to believe it, is profoundly liberating. The identity they gave you is not you. It is a theory about you, proposed by someone operating under their own constraints, limitations, and interests. You are allowed to revise the theory. Secret 14. Divide and conquer. Isolation as a control mechanism. The most powerful resource you have against manipulation is your social network. The people who know you, love you, and have no stake in your compliance. The friends who tell you the truth. The family members who remember who you were before. The community that provides alternative perspectives and independent reality checks are an almost insuperable obstacle to the person or institution that wants to control you. Your connections are your protection. This is why the first priority of serious controllers is always to sever those connections. The technique is ancient, present in military strategy, political theory, relationship abuse, cult dynamics, and authoritarian governance alike, because it is simply and consistently effective. A person embedded in a web of loving, attentive relationships is difficult to manipulate. The manipulation attempt is filtered through multiple perspectives, challenged by people who know the target, interrupted by the normal friction of community life. The same person isolated, told that their friends don't truly understand them, that their family is toxic, that the only people who really get it are inside this circle, is far more vulnerable. There is no one to say, wait, does this seem right to you? There is no alternative voice. There is only the manipulator's reality. In abusive relationships, isolation is frequently the first and most essential phase of control. It may present as intimacy. I want you all to myself. I love you so much I don't want to share you. Your friends are a bad influence. Your family doesn't support us the way I do. The language of love and connection is used to sever the connections that would otherwise provide protection. By the time the abusive behavior begins in earnest, the target is often already alone, in a way they may not have consciously registered. The cult achieves the same outcome through community rather than exclusion, or rather, through the creation of a community so total that it effectively replaces all prior relationships. You are not isolated. You are surrounded by people who believe what you believe, who reinforce what you are told, who interpret your doubts as the result of spiritual weakness rather than legitimate concern. The community is the isolation because every member of it has been recruited to the same narrative. Political divide and conquer works at the level of the population. If you can get people who share fundamental interests to define those interests as opposed, to see each other as threats rather than potential allies, they will not combine against the power that benefits from their division. They will be too busy fighting each other. The specific identity categories through which this division is driven change across history, but the structure is invariant. In workplace settings, isolation presents as information control. Certain people are kept out of certain conversations. Certain relationships are discouraged. Certain alliances are characterized as political or inappropriate. The person who is being managed out of a job or kept in a disempowered position is often first managed out of the social structures that would give them information, support, and leverage. The maintenance of your social connections, particularly the ones that provide honest, independent perspective, is therefore not merely a personal good, it is a structural defense. When someone, for any reason, persistently works to distance you from the people who knew you before, or who challenge the narrative being constructed around you, this pattern of distancing deserves careful attention regardless of how it is framed. Love does not isolate, control does. Secret 15. Emotional dependency. Creating need to gain control. There is a particular pattern of connection that feels, from the inside, like the most profound intimacy. The person who understands you perfectly. The relationship that feels like home in a way nothing has before. The sense that you have finally found someone who sees you, who gets the particular texture of your inner life, who seems almost preternaturally attuned to your needs and your history and your wounds. The relief of it, the gratitude. Some of this is love, and it is genuine. And some of it is a very carefully manufactured experience, designed to create a dependency that will later be leveraged. Emotional dependency as a manipulation technique operates in two phases. The first phase is the cultivation of need, the construction of an emotional environment in which your needs for connection, understanding, affirmation, and security become organized around a specific person. This phase is often experienced as deeply positive. The manipulator is attentive, generous, attuned, available. They remember what you said 3 weeks ago. They anticipate what you need before you ask. They make you feel, perhaps for the first time, truly known. The second phase begins when the dependency is established. Now the attentiveness becomes intermittent. The availability becomes conditional. The understanding is withheld precisely when you need it most, and restored when you comply with what is expected of you. The relationship has transitioned from a source of unconditional connection, which is what it appeared to be, to a system of conditional reward and punishment, in which the emotional supplies you have come to depend on are dispensed based on your behavior. This pattern is called intermittent reinforcement, and it produces, in both human beings and other animals, a peculiarly intense and resistant form of attachment. The unpredictability of the reward, sometimes available, sometimes not, for reasons that are not fully transparent, produces the same neurological response as gambling. The brain learns that the reward might come at any moment, and it maintains a state of heightened alert and focus on the source of potential reward. The relationship becomes consuming in the way that addictions are consuming. The person caught in this pattern is often aware that something is wrong. They know the relationship is painful. They know they have given up things, other relationships, opportunities, dimensions of themselves, in service of maintaining it. But the prospect of losing the connection feels more threatening than the pain of maintaining it, because by now the emotional architecture of their well-being is substantially built around this person. The dependency is structural. The manipulation has succeeded. Recognizing emotional dependency manipulation requires asking, as honestly as possible, whether the relationship you are in is a source of expansion or of contraction. Do you have more access to yourself within this relationship or less? Do you maintain connections to other people and sources of meaning? Or have those connections diminished as this one has grown? Does this person's apparent care for you remain consistent, or does it fluctuate in ways that seem connected to your compliance? Does the relationship make you feel more capable and more yourself, or less? Love is available, not intermittent. It does not require you to earn it repeatedly. The feeling that you must continuously prove yourself, that the connection you depend upon can be withdrawn without warning, is not the feeling of being loved. It is the feeling of being controlled. The difference matters more than anything else in this chapter. Secret 16. Timing manipulation, catching you at your weakest moments. Decision quality varies. Not with intelligence, not with experience, not with the complexity of the decision, but with the state of the person making it. The same person, facing the same choice, in conditions of rest, good nutrition, low stress, and emotional stability, will make different decisions than they will when tired, hungry, stressed, emotionally raw, or overwhelmed. This is not a character deficiency, it is neurological reality, and the person who wants to manipulate your decisions knows it. Timing manipulation is the deliberate exploitation of states of reduced cognitive and emotional capacity to extract compliance that better conditions would not produce. It is the ask that arrives precisely when you are least equipped to evaluate it carefully. Not by accident, but by design. The most well-studied version of this is ego depletion. Research on judges found that defendants appearing before the court early in the day or directly after a break received significantly more favorable rulings than those appearing in the middle of long sessions. The difference was not in the merits of the cases. It was in the mental and emotional resources of the decision-makers. As the day wore on and decisions accumulated, the judges defaulted increasingly toward the status quo, the safe, effortful thinking, minimal option of denial. The defendants' fates were partly determined by when their case was scheduled. You are not a judge, but the same dynamics shape your daily decisions. The request made after a long day when you're already depleted. The important conversation initiated at midnight, when you're exhausted and emotionally raw. The contract presented at the end of a marathon negotiation session, when everyone is tired and just wants to be done. The pressure applied when you are in a state of grief or anxiety or crisis, when the emotional resources available for careful analysis are already overwhelmed by the demands of simply coping. Experienced manipulators observe your states with attention. They notice when you are tired, when you are stressed, when you have just received difficult news, when you are most desperate for resolution, and therefore most willing to accept a poor one. These are the moments they choose, not because they are uniformly malevolent. Sometimes the timing is unconscious, a conditioned response to opportunity, but because the timing works. The defense has two components. First, be explicitly aware of your own state before making significant decisions. If you are tired, grieving, stressed, hungry, or emotionally flooded, almost all important decisions can wait. The decision that cannot wait deserves special scrutiny, because urgency is frequently manufactured precisely to prevent you from waiting until you are in a better state. Second, notice the timing patterns in your relationships and environments. Does a particular person or institution consistently make their most important requests at your lowest moments? Does the urgency always seem to coincide with your periods of vulnerability? This pattern, if it exists, is not random. It is information. Secret 17. The silent strategy. Withholding communication to gain power. There is a form of power that operates through absence. It does not speak, it does not accuse, it does not demand. It simply withdraws, becomes unavailable, goes quiet, offers nothing, and waits for the person on the other end of the silence to fill the void with anxiety, self-doubt, and the kinds of compliance that anxiety and self-doubt reliably produce. Silence as a manipulation strategy is as old as human relationships. In its most conscious form, it is called stonewalling or the silent treatment. In its more sophisticated versions, it is calibrated and intentional. Withdrawal of communication, affection, or engagement as a response to behavior the manipulator wishes to discourage, followed by the restoration of communication as a reward for behavior they wish to encourage. The silence is the punishment. The speaking is the carrot. The reason this works so reliably is rooted in the same evolutionary architecture as social proof and authority. Human beings are acutely sensitive to social connection and acutely threatened by its absence. Being ignored by a significant other activates the same neural pain pathways as physical harm. Being excluded, dismissed, or rendered invisible by someone whose attention you depend on is not merely uncomfortable. It is experienced at the level of the nervous system as a threat to survival. This means that the person deploying silence as a power tool has access to one of the most potent levers available. They are not causing physical harm. They are not saying anything objectively unkind. They are simply not there. And the experience of their absence is so distressing that the target will often do whatever is necessary to end it. The silent treatment is recognizable in its cruder forms, but sophisticated silence manipulation is harder to name. The partner who becomes subtly less available, slightly less warm, slightly more distracted, following a conversation in which you asserted a need, and who returns to full warmth following your implicit retraction of the assertion. The manager who becomes non-responsive to your emails following a meeting in which you raised a concern. The friend whose engagement with you cools after you did something they disapproved of, without their ever having said so explicitly. In each case, the absence is communicating something, and what it is communicating is, there are consequences for behavior I don't approve of, and the consequences are my withdrawal. The genius of this technique is that it is deniable. Nothing was said. No threat was made, no explicit demand was issued. You cannot confront silence directly, there is nothing to confront. You can only sit with the anxiety it produces and decide whether you would rather maintain your position or restore the warmth that makes the relationship bearable. Defense requires recognizing the difference between genuine need for space, which is real and which everyone is entitled to, and weaponized silence. The difference is in the pattern. Does this person's silence follow a consistent pattern related to your behavior? Does it reliably end when you comply with an implicit expectation? Does it cause you to monitor and modify your behavior in anticipation of its return? You are not required to fill every silence. Some silences deserve to be met with your own equanimity, your own capacity to sit with discomfort without capitulating to it. The silence loses its power the moment you stop experiencing their absence as an emergency. Secret 18. Labeling and categorization, defining you to limit your behavior. Names are not neutral. The moment a label is applied to you, whether by someone else or by yourself, it does not merely describe, it prescribes. It creates a set of expectations, a behavioral script, a category with implicit rules about how a member of that category acts, feels, thinks, and limits themselves. The label is not a mirror, it is a cage shaped like a description. This is labeling as a manipulation technique, and it is one of the most durable because it operates through your own self-concept rather than against it. The manipulator does not need to continuously apply pressure if they have successfully convinced you to apply it yourself. Diagnostic labels in mental health carry particular power and particular ambiguity. At their best, they are clinical tools that organize understanding and guide treatment. At their worst, they are identity impositions that tell someone who they fundamentally are, what they are capable of, and what they should expect from themselves, often in ways that constrain far more than they clarify. The person who is told, especially in early life, that they have a disorder that makes it difficult to sustain attention, regulate emotion, relate to others, function under stress, may internalize that description as a defining characteristic rather than as a partial, functional account of specific challenges. Social and political labeling follows the same mechanism at larger scale. If you can get people to accept labels for themselves and others, liberal, conservative, educated, uneducated, rational, emotional, successful, struggling, you have created categories with associated behavioral expectations that are difficult to violate without cognitive and social cost. The label determines who you are allowed to agree with, what positions you are allowed to hold, which other labeled groups you are supposed to distrust. The category does the controlling. In interpersonal dynamics, labeling is often deployed preemptively against people who might otherwise push back against manipulation. "You're too sensitive" is a label that invalidates emotional responses before they are fully expressed. "You always do this" is a label that turns a specific behavior into a permanent characteristic, making change seem impossible. "You're the type who" is a label that reduces the complexity of a person to the single characteristic most useful to the labeler. The label doesn't have to be accurate to be effective. It has to be believed. The deepest and most damaging labels are the ones applied in childhood, by the people with the most authority to define your identity. The child labeled as the difficult one, the troubled one, the slow one, the one who needs help, regardless of the accuracy of the assessment, carries that label into adulthood where it functions as a behavioral governor. The label sets a ceiling, and a ceiling, once believed in, never needs to be enforced externally. Defending against labeling manipulation requires the practice of distinguishing between what you did and what you are. Behavior is specific, contextual, and changeable. Character is the pattern of behavior over time. Labels conflate the two. They take the behavior and declare it the character, the specific and declare it the permanent. The defense is to refuse the conflation. I did that in that context, and it does not follow that I am that, and whatever I am not only that. Secret 19. False urgency. Forcing decisions under pressure. Most important decisions can wait. This is a simple fact that an enormous amount of sophisticated pressure is designed to make you forget. The manipulation of urgency, the artificial imposition of time pressure on decisions that would, in the natural course of events, benefit from reflection, consultation, and the kind of calm assessment that only time and distance from the immediate moment can provide, is one of the most pervasive and effective tools in the manipulation arsenal. It works by attacking the most reliable defense against poor decisions: the pause. Manufactured urgency and scarcity, examined in an earlier chapter, are close relatives. Both use the specter of imminent loss to compress decision-making. The difference is emphasis. Scarcity says this thing is almost gone, while false urgency says you are almost out of time. Both have the same functional goal: to force the decision before the conditions required for good judgment can be established. The most extreme version of this appears in high-pressure sales environments. The salesperson who creates the sense that you must decide tonight. Before you can sleep on it, consult your partner, do independent research, or access any state other than the one they've deliberately induced, is not trying to serve your interests. They are trying to prevent you from accessing the resources that would allow you to recognize their offer as less favorable than it appears. But false urgency is deployed in contexts far more intimate than card dealerships. The relationship partner who says we need to decide this right now, tonight, is often preventing the reflection that would produce a different decision. The manager who needs an answer in the next hour has frequently decided that the answer they want is more likely to emerge in the next hour than in a week. The family member who presents a difficult request in a moment of emotional intensity, when the emotional state of the moment makes refusal feel cruel, has timed their ask with some awareness, however unconscious of what conditions produce yes. There is a useful diagnostic for false urgency. Ask what happens if the deadline is missed. In many cases, the actual answer is not much. The sale continues next week under the same terms. The decision can be revisited, the relationship does not end, the opportunity does not disappear. In these cases, the urgency is revealed as a performance, a frame applied to the situation to compress your decision-making, rather than to accurately represent its stakes. In cases where the urgency is real, where there are genuine consequences to delay, the deadline is usually verifiable, independently confirmable, and does not require you to take anyone's word for it. Real deadlines exist in the world as objective facts. Manufactured deadlines exist in the conversation as assertions. Make it a policy. Significant decisions made under extreme time pressure deserve a second look, preferably after the pressure is dissipated. If the decision still looks right without the urgency, it probably was right. If it looks different, or if the urgency turns out to have been manufactured, you have learned something important about both the decision and the person who presented it. Secret 20. Normalization of control. Making manipulation feel normal. We have arrived at the 20th and final secret, and it is in some ways the most important, because it is the one that makes all the others invisible. Normalization is the process by which behaviors, relationships, and social structures that are fundamentally controlling become, through repetition and cultural saturation, simply the way things are. They stop appearing as choices that were made, structures that were built, arrangements that could be otherwise. They appear as reality, and reality by definition cannot be manipulated. It can only be adapted to. This is the manipulation of the last resort. The manipulator who can normalize their control doesn't need to continue deploying specific techniques. The target has been recruited to the maintenance of their own constraint. They are no longer being pushed. They have internalized the direction of the push as their own. Consider the range of things that were, within living memory or historical record, successfully normalized. The idea that women were not suited for public life, that certain groups of people were inherently less capable of self-governance, that children were the property of parents rather than developing persons with rights, that workers had no legitimate claim on the conditions of their labor, that deference to authority in all its forms was a virtue rather than a vulnerability. These were not fringe positions. They were mainstream, legally encoded, culturally reinforced certainties. The people who held them were not, by the standards of their own time, unusual. They were the normalization of control in personal relationships is the mechanism that keeps people in situations they would otherwise recognize as untenable. The partner whose controlling behavior is so consistent that it has become the background of life rather than an event within it. The family dynamic in which one person's emotional needs are structurally prioritized over everyone else's. And this prioritization is so long-standing that it is invisible as a choice. The workplace culture, in which exploitation of employees is so embedded in the organization's identity that it presents itself as commitment, passion, or simply the way things work in this industry. Normalization works by comparison. Compared to what? If you have never experienced a relationship without these dynamics, how do you know that these dynamics are not simply what relationships are? If your entire social environment treats a controlling arrangement as normal, what internal resource allows you to name it as something other than normal? The isolated person, isolated by design, as we discussed in the chapter on Divide and Conquer, has no comparative reference point. They cannot see what they have never seen. The practice of denormalization is therefore one of the most politically and personally radical things available to a human being. It is the act of restoring something's status as a choice, rather than accepting it as a fact. This requires, above all, the willingness to ask the question that normalization prevents. The answer to those questions is not always revolutionary. Sometimes you examine the normalized arrangement carefully and conclude that it is actually acceptable or even good. But the examination is everything. The person who has chosen their situation consciously is in a fundamentally different relationship to it than the person who has simply accepted it as the way things are. You have now seen all 20 secrets. They are not going to stop operating. They were operating on you before you read this book. They will operate on you after. The world is not going to rearrange itself in respect for your newly acquired awareness. But you are different now. And that difference, extended into practice, changes everything. Part 3. Where Manipulation Hides. Chapter 24. Media and Advertising. How Your Desires Are Engineered. Before you read this chapter, do a quick inventory. What are you wearing right now? What did you eat today? What does your home look like? What does your body look like? Or more precisely, what do you wish it looked like? What do you believe about what constitutes a successful life, a good relationship, an attractive person, a meaningful career? Now ask, where did those preferences come from? The honest answer, for most people in media-saturated societies, is that they came from a combination of genuine experience and an extraordinarily elaborate, enormously funded, decades-long project to engineer them. The distinction between the two is almost impossible to untangle at the individual level, which is precisely the point. Advertising is the most visible arm of desire engineering, and it has been remarkably candid in the trade literature, if not in its public communications, about what it is actually doing. The goal of advertising is not, in general, to inform you about a product and trust you to evaluate it rationally. The goal is to create an emotional association between the product and a feeling you already want: belonging, attractiveness, competence, freedom, security, love. And to make that association so automatic and so deep that encountering the product produces the feeling before thought intervenes. This is why advertising so rarely features claims about product performance that could be independently verified. The advertisement that shows you a beautiful person in a beautiful landscape drinking a specific beverage is not making a verifiable claim. It is performing an emotional association. Beauty is available to those who drink this. The landscape is yours. The feeling in your chest, expansive, free, desirable, is what this costs. The mechanism is not reason but conditioning. What makes this manipulation, rather than mere communication, is the scale, the sophistication, and the asymmetry. The industry employs the best psychologists, the best data scientists, the best creative minds to engineer your desires with more precision than any previous generation could have imagined. You bring your biology, your accumulated needs, your vulnerabilities, your social anxieties, your desire to be seen as the kind of person you want to be. They bring decades of research into exactly how to reach those vulnerabilities and attach their product to them. The encounter is not between equals. Media, news, entertainment, social content operates through related mechanisms. The news that you consume has been selected, framed, and sequenced according to principles that prioritize your emotional engagement over your accurate understanding of the world. This is not a conspiracy. It is an incentive structure. Engagement keeps you watching, clicking, returning. Engagement is produced most reliably by emotional arousal, particularly fear, anger, and outrage. The media ecosystem is therefore structurally incentivized to produce a world that feels more frightening, more enraging, more divisive than the one you would encounter if you walked outside. The entertainment industry shapes your model of human relationships, beauty, success, and possibility in ways so pervasive that they are nearly invisible. The norms of attractiveness you internalized, the relationship scripts you follow, the career aspirations you pursue, the goods of life you orient around, these were not neutral cultural transmission. They were economic products, created and distributed by industries with financial interests in the particular preferences they produced. None of this means you must reject all desire, all preference. All aesthetic judgment is corrupted. That way lies paralysis. What it means is that your preferences deserve examination. Not constant second-guessing, but periodic honest inquiry. Where did this come from? Does this serve me? Would I choose this if it had never been offered to me as desirable? The answers to these questions, over time, constitute the work of reclaiming your own desire from the machinery that has been engineering it since before you were old enough to notice. Chapter 25. Social Media Algorithms. The invisible system shaping your thoughts. There is a decision being made about you right now, or rather, millions of decisions happening in fractions of a second, in data centers you will never visit, by systems no human being fully understands. These decisions determine what you see, in what order, with what emotional valence, at what time of day, following what prior content. They determine, to a degree that would disturb you if you felt it clearly, what you think about, what you feel, what you believe is happening in the world, and who you believe you are in relation to others. This is the social media algorithm, and it is the most sophisticated manipulation apparatus ever constructed. The term algorithm suggests mathematical neutrality, a procedure, a calculation, a process without preference or agenda. This framing is one of the most important pieces of misdirection in the technology industry's public communications. Algorithms are not neutral. They encode the objectives of their creators, and the objectives of social media platforms are not your well-being, your accurate understanding of the world, your meaningful connection with others, or your psychological health. The objective is engagement, the maximization of the time you spend on the platform and the frequency with which you return. Engagement, as we have discussed, is produced most reliably by emotional arousal. Not just any arousal, specifically the arousing emotions: outrage, fear, envy, moral indignation, anxiety, and the particular pleasure pain of social comparison. Content that produces these states generates more clicks, more reactions, more comments, more shares than content that produces calm, contentment, or considered reflection. The algorithm learns this about your specific psychology through constant experimentation, billions of micro-experiments on billions of users, and optimizes your feed accordingly. This means that your information environment is not a reflection of the world. It is a reflection of what keeps you engaged, which is a reflection of your emotional vulnerabilities, amplified. The algorithm has discovered your particular flavor of arousal and is serving it to you continuously in increasing concentrations, because increasing concentrations produce increasing engagement. This is the mechanism of political radicalization through social media. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires only that the optimization target is engagement, that extreme content generates more engagement than moderate content, and that the algorithm is very good at its job. The social comparison dimension of social media deserves particular attention. Human beings have always compared themselves to others. This is a normal and, in some forms, adaptive cognitive process. But we evolved to make social comparisons within a reference group of perhaps a few hundred people, most of whom we encountered regularly and knew in 3 dimensions. Social media exposes you to a curated highlight reel of millions of people's best moments, most impressive achievements, most attractive presentations, and most enviable experiences. The comparison set is vast, the content is selected for impressiveness, and the mechanism operates continuously. The result is a comparison environment unprecedented in human history, one that systematically inflates the perceived success, attractiveness, happiness, and social connectedness of others relative to what you experience in your own life. This produces a chronic low-grade inadequacy, a sense that the life you are actually living is somehow below what a person like you should have, which in turn produces the anxiety and aspiration that make you susceptible to exactly the products and identities that the platform's advertising partners are trying to sell you. Taking back your attention from these systems is one of the most politically and psychologically radical acts available to an individual in the current period. It does not require rejecting all technology, but it does require recognizing that the technology is not serving you. It is using you, and deciding consciously what relationship you want to have with systems designed to extract your attention for others' profit. Chapter 26. Workplace Dynamics. Power, Politics, and Silent Control. You probably spend more waking hours at work than in any other environment. And the workplace is one of the most sophisticated manipulation environments you will ever inhabit, because it combines in a single system almost every technique we have examined: authority influence, identity manipulation, micro-commitments, information overload, false urgency, labeling, the normalization of control, and the particular power of economic coercion, which makes all the others more effective because you cannot simply leave. The workplace is not usually experienced as a manipulation environment. It is experienced as a professional environment, a collaborative environment, sometimes a community environment, and it can be all of these things authentically. But it is also structurally a power relationship in which your economic survival depends on the approval of people above you in a hierarchy, and both you and those people are operating within that constraint simultaneously. Performance management systems are particularly rich with manipulation technique. The annual review process, in most organizations, is designed as much to manage employee expectations and extract commitment as to accurately assess and develop talent. The framing of your performance in terms of growth opportunities rather than deficiencies is framing technique. The goal-setting process that makes you co-author your own stretch targets is micro-commitment technique. The culture of feedback that discourages you from perceiving criticism as anything other than a gift is identity manipulation. None of this is necessarily malicious. All of it is technique. Organizational culture, the set of beliefs, norms, and behavioral expectations that define life within an institution, is perhaps the most sophisticated normalization mechanism in modern workplaces. When the culture says that working weekends is passionate, that asking for boundaries is uncommitted, that emotional responses to unfair treatment are unprofessional, that loyalty to the organization should supersede personal needs, these are manipulation frames embedded so deeply in the daily texture of work that they stop appearing as choices. The language of organizational culture is particularly important to examine. The corporation that calls itself a family is deploying a relationship frame that has specific behavioral implications. Families don't negotiate terms. Families don't leave when conditions deteriorate. Families put the group ahead of individual needs. The company that speaks of its mission as a calling is deploying a religious frame that elevates the organization's goals above the workers' personal interests. These frames are chosen deliberately because they produce higher tolerance for poor treatment than more accurate transactional frames would allow. None of this means that workplaces are simply predatory systems to be resisted. Organizations can be genuinely good places, with genuine care for the people within them. The question is always the same: whose interests are being served by the frame being offered? When an organization tells you that personal sacrifice in service of its goals is a virtue, does that frame serve you, or does it serve the organization's interest in extracting more from you at lower cost? Being conscious in a workplace does not require being hostile or uncooperative. It requires knowing what you are there for, what you are willing to give, and under what conditions, and refusing to let the emotional management techniques of organizational culture override your own clear accounting of your interests. You can be a genuinely good colleague, a genuinely committed professional, and still be clear-eyed about the power dynamics in which you operate. These are not contradictions. They are the components of sustainable, professional life. Chapter 27. Relationships and Emotional Control. Recognizing toxic influence patterns. The manipulation that happens in close relationships is the most difficult to see clearly, because it is embedded in the most valuable thing in human life: love, family, friendship, partnership. These are real and they are good, and the manipulation that sometimes exists within them does not negate their reality or their goodness. It complicates it, and complication, unlike simple evil, is hard to name and harder to act on. We have visited various relationship manipulation techniques throughout this book: gaslighting, emotional dependency, isolation, intermittent reinforcement, the silence strategy. In this chapter, we draw the threads together by asking a different kind of question. Not what the specific techniques are, but how manipulation in relationships can be distinguished from the normal difficulties of loving another flawed human being. Because relationships are difficult. Healthy ones, too. People hurt each other accidentally, communicate badly, have misaligned needs, fail to show up in the ways they intended. The existence of pain in a relationship is not evidence of manipulation. The existence of conflict is not evidence of control. The existence of behavior that costs you something is not by itself evidence that the behavior was designed to cost you something. The distinction between relationship difficulty and relationship manipulation lies in several key dimensions. The first is pattern. Does this behavior repeat? And does it repeat in ways that seem to follow your attempts to assert your needs? express disagreement, or establish boundaries. Normal relationship difficulty is inconsistent. It follows the texture of two complex people trying to inhabit a shared life. Manipulation follows a logic. The pain tends to occur when you exercise agency, and tends to lift when you surrender it. The second dimension is accountability. When you raise a concern about this person's behavior, how do they respond? Do they hear you, acknowledge impact, and engage genuinely with the possibility of change? Or do they deflect, minimize, counterattack, question your motives, or turn the concern back on you? The inability to receive concern without defending against it is not a temperamental quirk. It is a pattern that has functional consequences for the relationship's power dynamics. The person who can never be wrong cannot be in an equal relationship. The third dimension is cost accumulation. Are you becoming less yourself over time in this relationship or more? Have you given up things, friendships, interests, opinions, aspects of your identity in response to explicit or implicit pressure from this person? Does the relationship require a version of you that you did not choose and would not choose? The fourth dimension is reciprocity. Do the patterns of consideration, sacrifice, and emotional labor run in both directions? Or has a division of labor been established, however gradually, however naturally appearing, in which one person's needs are structurally more important than the others? Naming these patterns in your own life requires a kind of honesty that is genuinely difficult. The person who manipulates you may love you. You may love them. The manipulation and the love are not mutually exclusive. And this is what makes these questions so hard. But the difficulty of the questions does not reduce their importance. The relationships that form the context of your life determine more than almost anything else who you become. The quality of your attention to them matters accordingly. Part 4. Breaking the Code. Chapter 28. Awareness as a Weapon. How to Spot Manipulation Instantly. Everything in this book has been building toward a single practical outcome. The moment when you encounter a manipulation technique, in real time, in the middle of a conversation, a transaction, a media experience, a relationship dynamic, and you recognize it before it has fully worked. This moment is not about suspicion. It is not about hostility or paranoia, or the kind of exhausting hypervigilance that treats every human interaction as a threat assessment. It is about a particular quality of attention, spacious, curious, grounded, that allows you to observe what is happening in your own experience without being entirely consumed by it. The first and most important awareness skill is the body-first check. Before you can catch manipulation in your thinking, you can often catch it in your body. The physical sensations associated with the manipulation techniques we've examined are distinct and recognizable. The tightening of the chest that accompanies manufactured fear, the particular quality of guilt, a heavy downward feeling different from the cleaner discomfort of genuine remorse, the rush and contraction of manufactured urgency, the peculiar combination of excitement and anxiety that social proof produces, the sense of smallness that comes with effective labeling. These are physical facts before they are cognitive ones. Training your awareness to catch them first gives you precious seconds before the cognitive story solidifies. The second awareness skill is the source question. Who wants me to feel what I'm feeling right now? And what do they want me to do about it? This question is not paranoid. It is simply applied analysis. Emotions in a social context are frequently, though not always, communications from other people. Asking whose interests are served by your current emotional state is a rapid diagnostic that catches manipulation attempts before you've processed them consciously. The third awareness skill is the exit test. If I walked away from this situation right now, if I did nothing, what would actually happen? The fear that an acceptable outcome is foreclosed by inaction is the engine of most urgency manipulation. Subjecting that fear to honest evaluation, actually walking through what a reasonable worst case looks like if you simply wait, frequently reveals that the stakes were inflated. Most things can wait. Most exits are not as closed as they feel. These skills are not innate. They are practiced. In the beginning, you will catch manipulation in retrospect. An hour later, a day later, you will recognize what happened and feel the frustration of having seen it too late. This is fine. This is the beginning of the learning. Over time, with practice, the recognition moves earlier in the sequence. Eventually, it arrives before the manipulation has completed its work. Eventually, it arrives in the first seconds, as a quiet noticing. The goal is not to become manipulation-proof. No one is. The goal is to reduce the percentage of your decisions that are made for you and increase the percentage that are made by you. Every increment of awareness in that direction is a recovery of self that compounds over time. The manipulation code can be read. You are reading it now. Chapter 29. Emotional Mastery. Controlling your reactions instead of being controlled. The goal of emotional mastery is not the elimination of emotion. It is not the cultivation of stoic detachment, the production of affectless calm, or the suppression of the rich and difficult texture of inner life that makes us human. The goal is a different relationship to emotion, one in which you have emotion rather than being had by it. This distinction is everything. The person who is had by their emotions experiences them as total. Fear does not feel like information about a possible threat. It feels like reality itself. Anger does not feel like a signal that something important has been violated. It feels like an imperative. Guilt does not feel like useful feedback about the gap between your values and your behavior. It feels like irrefutable evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. And in these totalizing emotional states, the space for choice collapses. You are inside the emotion rather than observing it. And inside the emotion, there is only the response it demands. The person who has their emotions experiences them as information, vivid, important, sometimes overwhelming, but ultimately signals to be attended to rather than forces to be surrendered to. They feel the fear, and they also ask, what is this fear about? And is the thing it's pointing at genuinely as threatening as it feels? They feel the anger, and they also ask, what important value is this anger defending, and how do I want to act on its behalf? They feel the guilt, and they also ask, does this guilt track an actual harm I caused? Or is it manufactured? The neurological basis for this distinction is well established. The emotional brain processes information faster than the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with deliberate reasoning, perspective-taking, and impulse control. Under conditions of high emotional arousal, the prefrontal cortex is effectively hijacked, and behavior is driven by the older, faster system. This is why manipulation techniques that induce high emotional arousal are so effective. They don't have to overcome your rationality, because rationality has already been taken offline. The practice of emotional mastery is therefore, at its core, the practice of maintaining access to your prefrontal cortex under conditions of emotional pressure. This is a trainable skill. It involves regular practice with the basic tools of self-regulation. Breathing techniques that activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Mindfulness practices that cultivate the observer perspective. Physical movement that discharges accumulated arousal. And the deliberate practice of sitting with difficult emotions rather than immediately acting from them. None of this is about becoming cold. It is about becoming spacious. Developing enough inner room that you can have a feeling and also have a thought at the same time. That room is where your agency lives. Every minute of practice you invest in expanding. It is a minute invested in making the rest of this book's insights available when you actually need them, which is not in the quiet moments of reflection, but in the heated moments when someone is pulling the levers and your old patterns want to respond exactly as expected. Chapter 30. Critical thinking skills. Questioning everything effectively. Critical thinking is not the same as skepticism, and it is not the same as cynicism. Skeptics doubt. Cynics dismiss. Critical thinkers examine. The distinction matters because both skepticism and cynicism are paradoxically susceptible to manipulation in their own way. The habitual doubter can be manipulated by the right authority. The habitual dismisser can be manipulated by the group that shares their contempt. Only the examiner is reliably resistant because examination is not a stance. It is a process. and the process produces different conclusions when different evidence is offered. The fundamental question of critical thinking is not, is this true? It is, how would I know whether this is true? The first question invites a verdict based on existing feelings. The second invites an inquiry into the basis of any verdict. Several critical thinking tools deserve to be foregrounded here because of their particular relevance to manipulation defense. The first is source analysis, not just identifying where information comes from, but asking what the source's interests are in your believing it. Every message is sent by someone, from somewhere, for some purpose. The purpose is not always to inform you accurately. Asking what the source gains from your compliance is not paranoia. It is basic information hygiene. The second is claims to evidence checking, separating the assertion from the evidence offered in its support, and asking whether the evidence actually supports the assertion. Most arguments, examined closely, turn out to involve leaps, places where the evidence is presented as supporting a conclusion that it does not actually establish. Catching these leaps is the core of critical evaluation. The manipulation almost always lives in the leap. The third is the consideration of alternatives. For every claim about what something means, asking what else it might mean. For every proposed solution, asking what other solutions might address the same problem. For every framing of a situation, asking what other framings would be possible. The capacity to generate alternatives prevents you from being trapped by the first interpretation offered, which is so often the interpretation someone needs you to hold. The fourth is the calibration of confidence, asking how certain you actually are about your beliefs relative to the evidence available. Manipulation frequently requires either overconfidence in the threat, in the solution, in the authority, in the social consensus, or underconfidence in your own judgment. Calibrating your confidence to the actual evidence available makes you resistant to both. The person who says, "I'm not certain enough about this to act without more information," is a very difficult target. Critical thinking cannot be applied to everything all the time. The cognitive demand would be paralyzing. The skill is in knowing when to apply it. The signals that critical thinking is warranted are often the same signals that manipulation is operating. Urgency, emotional pressure, authority assertion, complexity that feels designed to overwhelm, and the particular discomfort of a conclusion you are being pushed towards before you feel ready to reach it. Chapter 31. Setting Psychological Boundaries. Protecting your mental space. A boundary, properly understood, is not a wall and not a demand. It is a statement of what you will and will not participate in, made clearly and held consistently regardless of the response it produces. It is an expression of self-knowledge enacted in relationship, a declaration of who you are and what you require in order to function as yourself. The confusion about boundaries in popular culture is considerable. Boundaries are sometimes framed as ultimatums, sometimes as selfish assertions, sometimes as walls designed to keep people out. None of these framings is accurate, and all of them serve the interests of people who benefit from boundary-less targets. The deepest insight about psychological boundaries is that they are not primarily about other people. They are primarily about you. A boundary is not a request for someone to change. It is a statement of what you will do, given what they do. This distinction is crucial because it removes the boundary from the category of things that require other people's cooperation to function. You cannot control what others do. You can only control your own actions in response. A boundary lives in that control. The specific psychological boundaries most relevant to manipulation defense are the ones that protect the conditions under which good judgment operates. The boundary that says, "I do not make significant decisions under time pressure." The boundary that says, "I reserve the right to change my mind as I learn more." The boundary that says, "I will not engage with conversations whose explicit or implicit goal is to make me doubt my own perception." The boundary that says, "I am available to hear your concerns, and I will take them seriously, and I will not be punished for reaching a different conclusion than you." These boundaries will not be universally welcome. Manipulation often relies precisely on the absence of these boundaries, on your availability for immediate compliance, your responsiveness to emotional pressure, your uncertainty about your own perceptions. When you establish them, you will sometimes encounter resistance, and the resistance itself will be informative. The person who accepts your boundary, who adjusts to the reality that you are not available for time-pressured decisions, or for conversations that undermine your self-trust, is a safe person. The person who treats your boundary as an act of hostility or betrayal is telling you something essential about what they expected from you. Holding boundaries requires, above all, the tolerance of discomfort. The discomfort is real, the disapproval, the silence, the pressure to return to prior patterns. These are genuine costs of inhabiting yourself fully. But the alternative cost, remaining available to your own manipulation indefinitely, is larger, and its accumulation is slower, and its toll is paid in the currency of your own selfhood. Chapter 32. Reclaiming your autonomy. Making decisions on your own terms. Autonomy is not a destination. It is a practice. It is not achieved once through some transformative insight or decisive stand and then maintained effortlessly thereafter. It is chosen repeatedly in the small and the large moments of daily life, in the pause before the purchase, in the breath before the response, in the willingness to say, "I need more time to think about this," even when the social pressure to decide is intense. The person who has worked through this book and absorbed its frameworks is not suddenly autonomous. They have acquired tools. The tools only create autonomy through use, through the daily, often uncomfortable, frequently imperfect practice of applying them in real conditions. What does reclaiming autonomy look like in practice? It looks like doing your own research before accepting the conclusion your information environment is pushing you toward. It looks like asking, before you agree, what you are agreeing to and whether the agreement serves you. It looks like noticing the emotional state you are in before making a decision, and asking whether you would make the same decision in a calmer state. It looks like checking in with people whose perspective you trust before acting under conditions of urgency or pressure. It looks like keeping commitments to yourself as seriously as you keep commitments to others. It also looks sometimes like making the wrong choice, choosing freely and choosing poorly, and learning from that more than you would from making the right choice under pressure. Autonomous bad decisions are part of how you develop the judgment that produces better autonomous decisions. The person who has never chosen freely cannot build the faculty of free choice. Autonomy must be exercised to grow. The political and social dimensions of autonomy extend beyond individual practice. A society of genuinely autonomous people is resistant to the manipulation by which populations are controlled, through fear, through tribal identity, through the normalization of arrangements that serve the few at the expense of the many. Individual autonomy is therefore not merely a personal good, it is a public one. The practice of thinking clearly, feeling honestly, and choosing deliberately is, in aggregate, the only reliable foundation for the kind of society in which genuine human flourishing is possible. You began this book with invisible strings attached. You were unaware of most of them. You cannot remove them all. The strings of biology, of early conditioning, of cultural saturation are too deep and too numerous. But you can see them now, and what can be seen can be worked with. The strings that are visible can be untangled one by one through the patient daily practice of choosing to be, as much as any person can be in a world designed to prevent it, free. Part 5. Mastering Your Mind. Chapter 33. Reprogramming Your Thinking. Breaking old patterns of influence. You did not choose your first beliefs. You did not choose the cognitive patterns that were installed during your most formative years by the most authoritative voices in your environment, before you had the developmental capacity to evaluate them. You did not choose which fears were seeded, which self-concepts were reinforced, which rules about how the world works were presented as obvious facts rather than debatable interpretations. This is not a complaint about your upbringing, or an invitation to spend the rest of your life explaining yourself by what happened to you before you were 5. It is a statement of neurological fact. The brain is most plastic in early life, and the patterns established during that plasticity are, without active intervention, highly persistent. They do not simply update themselves as you encounter new information. They are the framework through which you process new information, which means that information which challenges the framework is often processed in ways that defend the framework rather than revise it. Reprogramming, the deliberate revision of established cognitive and emotional patterns, is possible. Neuroscience confirms this. The brain retains plasticity throughout life, and new patterns can be established through deliberate practice. But the process is neither quick nor comfortable, because it requires sustained effort in the face of the old pattern's automatic activation. The first step in reprogramming is identification. Before you can revise a pattern, you must be able to see it as a pattern rather than as reality. The thought "I am not capable of this" is not a fact. It is a pattern, established through some combination of early experience and subsequent reinforcement. The belief that asking for help is a sign of weakness is not a natural law. It is a rule, installed at some point by some mechanism, maintained by subsequent behavior, masquerading as a truth about you and the world. Identification requires noticing the automatic quality of a thought or response, the sense that this is simply how it is, rather than "this is how I am inclined to interpret this particular situation based on my history." The automatic response is the tell. Automaticity is where the programming lives. The second step is deliberate replacement, not suppression. Suppressing a pattern leaves it intact but underground, where it continues to operate while consuming additional resources to remain suppressed. Replacement means actively practicing a different response, thinking the different thought, feeling for the different feeling, allowing a different story to be told about the same facts. This is repetitive and sometimes tedious. It is also how neural pathways are established. The new pattern begins as an effort and becomes, through repetition, an automaticity of its own. The third step, and the most important, is compassion for the process. You are attempting to revise patterns that were established when you were vulnerable, by people and systems with enormous influence over you, in conditions where they felt not like patterns, but like survival. Approaching the revision with harshness is counterproductive. Self-criticism activates defensive responses that impede the very change it demands. The patterns change most reliably in conditions of safety and self-regard, which means that the project of reprogramming your thinking must itself be approached with the quality of mind it is trying to cultivate. Chapter 34. Building mental resilience. Becoming resistant to manipulation. Mental resilience is not hardness. It is not the capacity to feel nothing, to be unmoved by pressure, to maintain an armored distance from the full texture of human experience. Hardness is brittle. It does not bend and therefore breaks. Resilience is flexible. It bends, absorbs, and returns. The resilient mind is not the one that refuses to be affected. It is the one that can be affected and recover its orientation. The specific form of resilience most relevant to manipulation resistance is what might be called groundedness, a stable, accessible sense of your own values, perspectives, and needs that does not depend on external validation for its existence. The person who is well grounded does not require the approval of the current social environment to feel secure in their own judgment. They do not require the validation of authority to feel confident in their own perception. They are not immune to influence, but influence is received and processed against a stable internal reference point that holds. Groundedness is built through several practices. The first is value clarity, the deliberate articulation of what you actually believe and care about, independent of what you are supposed to believe and care about. This is harder than it sounds, because most of us have not spent sustained time with the question of what we actually value, as distinct from what our environment has told us to value. The exercise of writing your values, not the ones you think you should have, but the ones that actually guide your behavior and produce your most genuine responses, is clarifying in ways that continue to surprise people who undertake it seriously The second practice is perspective maintenance, the habit of checking your interpretation of events against your own longer view. Manipulation almost always operates in the present tense, in the current situation, against the current emotional state. It does not want you thinking about where you were last year, or what you will think about this decision in 5 years, or what the person you most respect would make of this situation. The resilient mind has access to the longer view even under conditions of immediate pressure. The third practice is recovery investment, the deliberate maintenance of the conditions under which your mind functions at its best: sleep, physical movement, time in environments that are not constantly stimulating and demanding, relationships that are genuinely restorative rather than merely entertaining or exciting. These are not luxuries. They are the infrastructure of mental resilience. The mind that is chronically depleted is not able to apply the tools in this book when they are most needed, which is precisely when the conditions of manipulation are most present. Resilience compounds each time you recognize a manipulation attempt and hold your ground. Each time you feel the pull and choose deliberately rather than automatically. The pathway of deliberate choice strengthens slightly, and the pathway of automatic compliance weakens slightly. The first few times are hard and imperfect. Over time, the practice becomes easier without becoming effortless. You remain a human being with human vulnerabilities. You simply become more skillfully, more consistently, more consciously yourself. Chapter 35. The Power of Awareness in Daily Life. Living consciously in a world of control. We have traveled far together in the pages of this book, from the invisible architecture of influence to the specific mechanics of 20 manipulation techniques, from the environments that host them to the tools that dismantle them, from the patterns that were installed without your consent, to the practices by which they can be revived. We arrive here at the last chapter before the conclusion, and the question it poses is the most practically important of all. What does living consciously actually look like in the ordinary texture of an ordinary day? It does not look like exhausting hypervigilance. It does not look like treating every human interaction as a threat to be assessed. It does not look like isolation, cynicism, or the kind of aggressive questioning of everything that makes you impossible to be with. Living consciously in a world designed to manage your awareness is not a warrior's posture. It is a quality of presence, a particular quality of being here, paying attention, and participating in your own experience rather than sleepwalking through it. It looks like the 10 seconds before you pick up your phone in the morning. The question, what do I actually want to attend to first today? Before an algorithm decides for me, it looks like the breath. Before the response in a conversation that has become heated. The question, what do I actually want to say? As distinct from what the emotional momentum of this moment is pushing me to say. It looks like the pause before the purchase. Not an interminable deliberation, but a genuine moment of asking, do I want this, or have I been made to want this? And does that distinction matter to me here? It looks like maintaining relationships with people who knew you before. People whose love for you is not contingent on your conforming to any current identity or narrative, who remember other versions of you, and can serve as anchors when you feel yourself drifting. It looks like the periodic practice of examining your beliefs and preferences for ones you did not choose. The quiet, non-dramatic work of separating what is genuinely yours from what was given to you by forces that were serving their own interests. It looks like being willing to not know. One of the deepest forms of manipulation is the social pressure to have arrived at a conclusion, to be definitive, to take a side, to project certainty in the face of genuine complexity. Living consciously includes the comfort of holding uncertainty, of saying, I don't have enough information to be sure about this yet, of refusing the binary options that so many social and media environments insist upon. And it looks like grace. The person who has genuinely worked through the material in this book is not harder or more defended than they were before. They are, if anything, more open, because the defenses they've developed are more specific and therefore less totalizing. You do not need to wall yourself off from influence in order to be protected from manipulation. You need only to know the difference. And you know it now. The world has not changed. The manipulation code is still running. In every advertisement, in every algorithm, in every social dynamic, and every structure of power in which you are embedded. But you have changed. And a changed person in the same world is, in the most important sense, living in a different one. Conclusion: becoming uncontrollable. The shift from victim to observer. Something has happened in the course of this book. If you have read it genuinely, not merely consumed its information, but allowed it to sit and reorder some of the furniture in your inner life, you are not the person you were when you opened the first page. This is not a boast about the book. It is a statement about the nature of genuine insight, which always changes the person who receives it. The shift is from victim to observer. These are not moral categories. The victim of manipulation is not someone lesser or weaker. They are someone uninformed about specific mechanisms operating on them, which is a temporary and correctable condition. The observer is simply someone who has enough perspective to see the game while being in it, not from outside. You cannot be outside. You are human, which means you are a target, but from a slightly different internal position. One that maintains just enough distance between stimulus and response to allow a choice. This shift is not completed by reading a book, it is begun by reading one. The completion happens in the practice, which is to say, in the rest of your life. In the 10,000 small moments when the old pattern wants to run and you pause, just barely, just long enough to choose. The observer is not cold. They feel everything the victim feels. They feel the fear and the guilt and the desire and the social pull and the urgency and the sense that they are not enough and that something they need might be taken away. These feelings do not stop. What changes is the millisecond between feeling them and acting from them. And in that millisecond, a small sovereign self exercises its right to choose. Living with clarity and independence. Clarity is not certainty. Do not confuse them. Certainty is the end of inquiry. It is the state of having settled a question permanently against subsequent evidence. Clarity is something different and far more useful. Clarity is the ability to see what is actually in front of you. The situation, the person, the choice, without the distortion of fear, the fog of manipulation, or the static of others' agendas. Clarity does not give you the right answers. It gives you accurate questions. Living with clarity means being willing to see things as they are, not as you need them to be, not as you've been told they are. It means looking at the relationship and seeing the pattern, even when seeing the pattern is painful and action is uncertain. It means looking at the belief and asking when you adopted it and why, even when the belief has been organizing your life for decades and its absence would be disorienting. It means looking at the system you operate within, economic, political, social, familial, and asking whose interests it serves and whether yours are among them. Independence in this context is not isolation. The fully independent person is a fiction and not a particularly admirable one. Human beings are social creatures, and our interdependence is not a weakness to be overcome, but a condition to be navigated wisely. Independence here means the independence of your judgment, the freedom to reach your own conclusions on the basis of your own assessment of the evidence, even when those conclusions are socially costly, even when they contradict the authority, even when they require you to change. The independent mind is the most dangerous thing to those who profit from managing minds. It cannot be reliably manipulated. It can be influenced. It is open to evidence and argument. It learns, it updates. But it cannot be made to believe something it has not genuinely arrived at. This makes it an anomaly in a world organized around the harvesting of attention and compliance. And anomalies in every era of history are where change begins. Your mind, your rules. You have lived until now in a world that has been trying to write rules in your mind about what is desirable, what is threatening, what is possible, what you are worth, what you should want, who you should fear, what constitutes a good life. The writers of these rules have been diverse. Parents, teachers, advertisers, Governments, algorithms, cultures, religions, employers, partners, friends. Not all of them have been malicious. Most have been operating within their own rule systems, passing on what they received. But the cumulative effect has been a mind furnished largely by others, serving largely others' interests. The declaration at the end of this book, "Your mind, your rules," is not a license for selfishness or a rejection of all received wisdom. It is something more fundamental. It is the assertion that the final authority on what you think, believe, feel, value, and choose is you, not the algorithm, not the authority, not the social consensus, not the fear that has been manufactured and amplified and deployed to keep you compliant, not the identity that was assigned to you before you had the capacity to negotiate it. You. This is in its quiet way a radical position. The world is not organized to produce it. Most of the forces examined in this book are, in one way or another, organized against it. Becoming the author of your own mind in a world designed to colonize. It is not a single act of resolution. It is a lifelong practice of attention, honesty, and the willingness to return to yourself again and again after every drift, every manipulation, every moment of having been taken along somewhere you did not choose to go. You will be manipulated again. The tools you've developed will sometimes come too late. The patterns you've identified will sometimes run before you can catch them. The emotions will sometimes be total before you can observe them. You will sometimes be the person this book started with, pulled along by invisible strings, making someone else's choice. But you will know it. And knowing is the beginning of choosing differently. That is enough. More than enough. It is, in fact, everything.